The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome back to the Lighting Controls Podcast, where we love to talk about lighting controls. Today we have a great guest, Robert Bell. He's going to talk to us about some great theatrical type lighting controls and how they integrate with architectural systems. But just wanted to let you know that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And also, we just want to thank our sponsor today, Acuity Brands, and Ron has some great information about that sponsor. Ron?
Yeah, so today we've got Robert on, like Webster said, and Robert Bell works for Acuity, but for Pathway Connectivity. And Pathway makes some fantastic equipment that we all use in both the theatrical and the architectural setting. So from both sides of the game, they really have you covered. They make everything from DMX splitters and mergers to DMX gateways and even purpose-built network switches, which you'll learn more about in today's podcast. They offer a full control solution to include everything from relay panels, button and fader stations, and touchscreen interfaces, and also devices that can be cloud connected. Be sure to check out everything that Pathway Connectivity has to offer. And please do not forget that you can check out our podcast moving forward on the lightingcontrolspodcast.com, and make sure you check it out. Move everything over there because this is no longer going to be hosted on Get a Grip. And do not forget to stop and shop for some sweet merch so that you guys can have all of the same cool stuff that we have as well. And now, here's our conversation with Robert.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast. Today we have a special guest, Robert Bell. Robert, do you mind just giving us a quick intro on who you are and what you do?
Sure. I've been doing this lighting thing since I got out of school, and that was about 1990. So, been going on, what is it, 32 years? And I'm currently the director of product market at Acuity Brands, in charge of the Pathway Connectivity line, and all of the Ethernet networking and the controls and data distribution. That's sort of my portfolio of stuff. Now, do I go back further, or do I start at the beginning and get to where we are, or do I go back?
You're welcome to introduce yourself however you want, but I think that'll suffice for now. But thank you so much for joining us here today. I mean, we love to talk with people who have been in the business for a while or are new to the business. However, their interest in lighting controls really is what brings them here today, is what we like to talk about. And I mean, you're with Pathway, which has a really interesting story when it comes to lighting controls, especially now that it's joined a larger group that does a lot more architectural stuff. But when it comes to Pathway, the primary focus of it for so long had been in theater. And so I'm curious, what the experience has been so far of this transition.
Well, I've been with Acuity Brands for 12 years, and at the very beginning, I was with a company called Horizon Control, and we were writing control software for entertainment technology and Strand. We did the palette software. Anyways, our company was acquired by Acuity, and about 6 months later, they acquired Pathway. And it was just convenient that I was Canadian and convenient that I already knew Pathway. So they merged our two engineering groups. But you ask about the transition, and the transition had been delayed by 8 or 10 years. The Calgary-based company worked with its own accounting system and its own enterprise resource planning system and its own part number system, and we almost exclusively sold through what we call the theatrical dealer market. So your Barbizons, Four Wall, Parlights, Murphy Lightings, those groups of people. And the whole Division 26 agency world was, something that we got brought into, but it certainly wasn't my forte or anything like that. So about less than 2 years now, we fully integrated into all the accounting systems and factory planning systems of Acuity. So at that point, I had to become an awful lot more familiar with what Acuity called CNI, commercial and industrial lighting, and the
Mm.
whole agency market. And that's just the front end. The back end was getting rid of our old accounting and ERP systems, and eventually this summer of 2022, we actually closed the factory in Calgary and moved to a much larger facility in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And so moving the factory, moving all the inventory, changing orders, the changing all the parts, and then all of the part numbers to what Acuity calls nomenclature. I mean, it's just a new website and new tech support line. So it's been a very busy last 2 years. Not that the first 10 years at Acuity wasn't busy,
Sure.
but it was just doing what I always did. Everything I've done in the last 2 years is being new. So,
Well, and so,
new
you
to
know,
me.
you brought up some terms that some of our listeners might not be familiar with, such as dealer. You know, people are more familiar with distributor in our industry, which is just somebody
Yeah.
who sells directly to a contractor. Whereas, Ron, you're a dealer. Do you want to
I
do a
am.
quick breakdown on what a theatrical dealer is versus an electrical distributor?
I mean, I can do my best, I guess. So, right. I mean, so a theatrical dealer is very different than a distributor as far as we don't handle a lot of architectural lines like a electrical distributor would, right? We don't do a lot of that sort of white lighting, those generic sort of fixtures. We don't do any electrical components, any of that sort of stuff. As a dealer, our main focus is theatrical and architainment, right? I love that word, architainment. We
Yes.
do a lot of that kind of architectural lighting. So we work with Pathway a lot. The new part numbers have thrown me for a loop. They're much longer than they used to be. It's taken me a little bit to get used to all that, but
They're more
so
extensible, though.
that is true. That is actually very true.
Yeah.
But overall, yeah, I mean, dealers are very much more focused in the theatrical market with all of the theatrical manufacturers versus a distributor, which has obviously a much larger array. And you'll also find differences as well, that the dealer network has certain things that the distributor network won't have and vice versa, right? So there are certain things that dealers will have and be able to offer that distributors cannot.
And I mean, to another degree, dealers offer services at times that distributors
Well,
won't.
yeah, there's
So,
that too.
for instance, you're an integrator and a dealer, and therefore you
Yep.
kind of hover over the product that you've sold and make sure that it's installed correctly and programmed correctly. But
In Division
yeah,
11,
so I mean,
you can do design build, and
Exactly.
the guy, Ron might be working in AutoCAD for the first 2 months of a project, but then he'll get in his white van and with his tools, and he'll be the guy. Where in Division 26, seriously, you have a massive general contractor and then an electrical contractor. And I love the electrical contractors. We say they like to bend pipe and pull wire, but normally they're pulling 12 gauge wire. So I always call it they're the big screwdriver guys, and guys like Ron and I are the little screwdriver guys,
The little
right?
screwdriver guy.
And
So true.
and not to be derogatory, but it just paints a picture. As I say, I don't need to explain to the dealers how to spell DMX.
Right.
And
sure.
like our world is DMX. I mean, you could call it dynamic lighting, you can call it theatrical lighting, you could call it architainment. It's generally not white light, even though white light sometimes can be quite dynamic. But it's funny how the discipline of understanding a protocol really defines a market. It's crazy because there's lots of lighting protocols, but
Well, and I think
DMX for
DMX
some.
is a very unique protocol to the typical architectural protocols out there. And there's a lot of nuance to how to use it, how to install it, how to program it.
Well, and it's also ridiculously high speed for
Sure.
general use. It's not a polling protocol. It's a very noisy broadcast protocol that insists on being in charge. There's no idea of like last action. Maybe inside of a theatrical console, there's an idea of last action, but on the wire, no. Like your time to last packet is always about 25 milliseconds. So it just keeps
Yeah.
coming at you. So all
Whereas with
kinds of things that happen in architectural lighting where you can have a very quiet wire and somebody presses a button and the lights respond, and then they just sit there and they sit there until somebody else, a completely different controller with maybe different permission, presses a button and says, please do this, and the light will either listen or not listen. Where DMX, it's like "Rah!" all the time, you know.
well, so for our listeners to visualize that difference, I mean, what you're saying is that DMX is constantly transmitting information all the time, and what that information
Very
is in
wasteful.
DMX. Yeah, right, sure. Well, theater's very wasteful, but
Yeah.
the point of it is just that it's constantly repeating the same information so that it can be picked up as quickly as possible. Whereas, say for instance, Dolly, you send a command, that command gets sent to the driver of the fixture, and the driver of the fixture then hears, okay, that's what I need to do now. But it doesn't send any other information after that until there's another action required.
Yeah. And that complicates the control end of it because you basically, we call it sources and sinks. So the source of the data and then the ones that consume the data are the sinks. And in the early days of DMX, there was one source, and typically the dimmer room was the sink and a wire between them. And I talked about last action or highest takes precedence or priorities. All these sort of things were completely within the domain of the guy who was building the lighting control console. But by the time it got to the back plate, to the 5-pin connector, all of that arbitration and all of that decision making was done. So you could have multiple cue lists, you could have some submasters, you could have different things happening. But it used to, all of that decision making process stopped at the back plate of the console. And then it was just a wire to get to all the sinks. And then we got clever. Pathway was, one of the first people to repeat that, sort of like a distribution amplifier for video. But what Pathway did before my time is they put a lot of that decision making process and arbitration on the wire with the path port, and the path port was then able to arbitrate between multiple sources and distribute to multiple sinks, and that was a paradigm shift. It was genius.
Well, so I mean, taking that mentality that you're dealing with a theatrical venue, dealing with dealers, and now you're joining this bigger group that's been in the architectural world for so long and thinks completely differently from that perspective. You said Division 26, which is the electrical division in CSI specifications, and Division 11, which is the theatrical division in CSI specifications. And those are, whether or not you've specified them in your project manual together doesn't mean that they aren't completely separate worlds, and that the way that they're treated in the process of bidding, construction, etc., is they're completely alien to each other. And so, you get a lot of people who, even in our industry, who have been doing Division 11 a lot, suddenly being thrown into Division 26, it can kind of be very surprising how different the world is.
Yeah, I mean the very tightly written specifications and reading the drawing. You ask any theater guy. I was a theater guy. Like I said, I climb ladders with a wrench in my back pocket. Right. I have brothers and sisters around the world that appreciate what that means. It's a very different thing than bending conduit, which I also did for a little bit as an installer for Strand Lighting. But if you bring a lighting plan out onto a stage and put it on a road case, our eyes gravitate to the graphic. It's like, okay, 18-inch centers, drop a 26 degree here and a 36 degree there and a moving light there. In CSI, don't even look at that. Just start reading the notes. If you don't start reading those notes, and your whole contract could be thrown out because you forgot one of the lines in the notes. And And that's a very different sort of discipline and way to approaching a lighting design. And I'm not sure I have the capability for that level of detail. I'm more of an
I
artistic
don't
person.
know. I don't know if the majority of our industry does, because I mean, CSI specifications are sometimes those overlooked documents that get pulled out during arbitration at the end of a project. But leading up to that point, it's just sort of like, where does it say that? Where did you ask
Yeah.
for that? And
Enter the
so,
lawyers.
yeah, exactly.
You're not getting the
But I
last
mean,
15% of this contract until you know, I don't know, ground those back boxes or whatever it ends up being that you forgot to read,
yeah.
So,
And so, I mean, as far as, theatrical terms, theatrical focus goes as well, because of the way that it's packaged with dealers, it's almost even more just parted out with when it comes to the architectural, commercial, and industrial side, because you have the distributor who then sells to the contractor who then installs it. But with the dealer, you can sometimes have the dealer who sells it and installs it themselves. But additionally, they're kind of an additional layer of protection for that project. Whereas with commercial and industrial, it could be that there's a mistake that tracks all the way through just because the specifier forgot to write that one line, or somebody overlooks that one line, or and there's just this snowball effect of mistakes. Whereas with theatrical side, it's almost like everybody's like, no, 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 make sure that this doesn't happen this way. And additionally, there's kind of a little bit of oversight when it comes to communication channels, whereas contractors won't, pick up the phone and call the lighting designer and say, hey, did you actually mean this? Whereas I feel in theatrical, there's a little bit more leeway where it's like, I know you said this, but did you actually mean that?
yeah. Or they could, yeah, they would never substitute without a discussion. But
Right.
theatrical dealers also aren't just that altruistic. They have an MO to have those relationships because some of the technology we put in. I mean, obviously, theater is the bleeding edge of technology, right? It will go mainstream after the fact, but because it's bleeding edge, look at the examples of the early days of moving lights and very light. You know, they literally put a tent around the repair section off stage right because the lights broke that much and they didn't want anybody to know how fragile and breakable they were. So so the Showco, the people that rented the lights, basically took on the whole responsibility to say the rig, all of it, or 90% of the rig will function, or you don't pay us. So it was their job. And then in permanent installations, that goes further too, because in the theater or um, rental market, there's consumables. So there's a reason to keep those relationships good, right? So
Mhm.
you take care of the customers because you want to interact with them again. Where an electrical contractor, once the job is signed off, he never wants to come in the building again, right?
Right.
He's on to the next job. So
No,
it's
I
a,
think
it's a
that's a
very
really good
different
distinction.
relationship. Yeah.
Definitely. No, and so taking that into mind, I mean, it's almost like you have to treat projects separate as separate entities if for instance you're doing like a complete theatrical venue versus if you're doing, some cafetorium attached to a school.
Hmm. Yeah. No, there's normally in the drawings, there's normally a big line around the cafetorium. It's kind of like, the electrical contractor is like, okay, I don't know what's inside of that box, but I'm scared of it. So I'm going to bring in a partner, you know, and and that's great. I mean, I'm all for our agencies. Acuity Brands has like 85 agents in North America in all of the divisions, right? And one of the things I would love to do is build relationships in territories between what we call LCSI, Lighting Control Systems Integrators, and the agency, so that they can pair electrical contractors with LCSIs, because um, there's still a certain amount of nuance when you get into dynamic lighting. There's
Yes.
optics, there's control protocols, there's controllers, there's shoving into the machine what I always call it art, right? You you could build a wonderful facade with RGB lights and stuff like that, but unless somebody knows how to create the art, you're just going to have white light.
Right.
So you have to be able to find somebody who can translate the lighting designer's idea into massive streams of zeros and ones that look pretty, and eventually have the owner of the building say, that's why I paid for my dynamic lighting. Look at this. It's, Prince died, turn the building purple. Gay pride, turn it rainbow.
Well, and I think, there's something to be said about that, where the owner actually realizes the value of what they've paid for, in converse to people who say, well, I can get the same thing for cheaper, so why don't I just go with the cheaper option? If you were to look at a system that was done by Pathway versus a system that was done by, cheapo depot
Somebody
LEDs,
else.
yeah, you may not realize that there's actually something else that goes on behind that's supporting the project that you wouldn't get with this cheaper alternative.
Yeah, no, and that's what leads us to create some of our incredible product lines, like the whole VIA entertainment switch. I mean, our switch is 10 times the price of a switch that you could pick up at the Office Depot. But we still sell an awful lot of them because there's reasons.
And so, that's a great thing to touch on, because a lot of people will go, well, why don't I just go with this cheaper switch? So, I mean, so our listeners can understand, like, what makes that switch more valuable in the end?
Well, I've spent good 5 years trying to tell that story, and the marketing plan that we do is, I call it Why VIA, right? And I have a number
VIA
of
being one of your
seminars
product
and
lines.
yeah, VIA. Sorry, yes, VIA is a entertainment class. We call it purpose built Ethernet switch with power over Ethernet capabilities. Um, and they started building it at Pathway before I joined Pathway, and it was because it was the Pathport, this sort of ubiquitous 22-year-old Pathport thing. This was the first one, not the first one, the first
A lot of
model.
theatrical folks will know what that is, but for people who are either listening or are unfamiliar with what that is a gateway for DMX. It has two 5-pin ports on it, and it's meant for theatrical DMX distribution. And it has an Ethernet connection on the back for PoE connectivity.
So the magic thing about this was that it was the first device in the world, not in theater, in the world, that used power over Ethernet that wasn't a telephone. There is a member of our community, the theatrical community. I used to work with him at Entertainment Technology, named um, Steve Carlson, and he was on the IEEE, the electrical standards that created the standard 802.3 AF, the power over Ethernet. So he helped usher that in. Now, obviously, the telephone companies just picked up on that immediately, and nowadays there's power over Ethernet cameras and everything. But this device here was the first thing that wasn't a phone that used PoE, and moreover, it was one of the first, not the first. Strand and ETC and Compulite were some of the first that were actually transmitting lighting data over the Ethernet jack, which would eventually come out 5-pin. Now, I already explained a little bit about how pathway connectivity really took that to a different level because of all the smarts that are in here that allow the arbitration of multiple sources and things. We've covered that already, but the interesting thing was, at the beginning, there was no VIA switch at Pathway Connectivity. So they were just saying, go buy your Cisco, Juniper, Extreme Network switches. But those are called enterprise class switches. They're great for ITs and buildings and printers and phones and all kinds of stuff. And when these switches, and I cover this a lot in my YVIA video series. Um, I'm telling a very big story, so I'm going to try to condense it. But I talked about when I was first doing networking, we used a hub, which is exactly like a DMX splitter. You put a one in here and 8 ones come out the other side. You put a 0 in here and 8 zeros go out the other side. There's no smarts to it whatsoever. So every device, every node on the network, a node being another hub, a computer, whatever, a printer, they all had to listen to everybody's chatter. And then there was some arbitration about, hey, don't talk and all this stuff. A switch, which is just a word that comes off our tongue like anything now, people forget that it actually does something. It is like a railway switch. So it will say, hey, Bob wants to talk to Sue, so don't even let Mary hear the conversation. So it can actually switch data very, very quickly. We call it at wire speed. So back to this thing before Pathway made a VIA, these enterprise class switches were making decisions that weren't very happy for the theater. They were looking at this very, very high speed protocol and they thought, ooh, that looks like a denial of service attempt, a denial of service attack. So we'll shut that port down, kind of like a governor on a race car and a pop-up valve on an Indy car.
Those who don't know what a denial of service attack is, do you mind just quickly explaining what that is?
Well, one of the things you can do to almost anything that's on a network is ping it. And if you really want to piss off a computer, you can just ping it incessantly. And it will get so busy responding to something like pings that it might not do what it's supposed to be doing. So
we never do that to each other here in the office.
So you might be trying lots and lots of passwords. You might be, I don't know, trying to just poke every part of the system looking for a hole. So the network switches, which are very intelligent beasts with lots of firmware behind them, can actually say, hey, it looks like you're having an attack from we call them, it's funny, this is where the terms cross. They're called bad actors.
Yep.
And we always said, bad actors aren't limited to the stage. They may be third party, it could be another nation trying to attack another nation. You hear about hacks all the time, ransomware and all the rest of it. So early versions of enterprise class switches looked at our DMX streaming data and would turn them off. And then this was again prior to me being at Pathway Connectivity, said, God, we really created something very special here, but we can't connect it to anything because the things we connect it to keep breaking it. And then people are like, well, why did I spend $1,000 for this thing, and I can't talk to it? So that's why they decided to make an entertainment class switch, the VIA. And its feature set has just grown and grown in its 12 years of existence. And it's now it was one of the very first purpose-built switches for entertainment. There are a number of companies which will take apart the metal from other switches and put them in robust switch casings with the Neutrix Ethercon connector, which is useful for touring. But they don't write the firmware and they don't write all the switch fabric rules and everything the way that Pathway Connectivity does, and one or two other people in the industry. But it's a very highly specialized science. And if anybody was wondering, we actually build circuit board solder, build and write the firmware that actually does the switching. And you say what makes us different is we make it very easy for a non-IT professional to set up a switch. So much so that a roadie on a rock and roll show can be talked through. This is not a VIA, but it looks like it's the same display. There's a front panel right on the front of the device, and you can roll and do it. You can use a walkie-talkie and talk somebody through how to set up VLANs or PoE allocations or EAPS, Ethernet Automatic Protection Switching, which is like ring protection. And you can do that from the front panel. You can also do it with our software, but you can't do that with a Cisco or Juniper network switches, And you literally,
But they're not
to configure a switch.
They're not intended for that kind of application. So
no, they're kind of set and forget. Where with the entertainment world, rental is obviously the extreme case, but there's often reasons where you need to change things 6 months in, and having a purpose-built switch that supports a lot of the standard IEEE protocols in a very easy to configure method, either using our software Passcape or the front panel. And one of the other things that is very well respected by our clients is, here's another example. If I bought a Linksys switch that was in a box that was this big and it was bluish and it had rubber feet and it had a little barrel connector on the back, and it was called the Model 1234, and you buy one in 2020 and you put it into a venue and it just happens to work, and you're like, great, from now on we're going to buy the Linksys Model 1234. What they will never tell you, and you will never find in the manual, is that they value engineered that product probably 3 times since you bought it last. And it might have a completely different set of guts and guaranteed completely different firmware. But it's still blue, it's still got rubber feet, it's still got a barrel connector. It's still called Model 1234, but it is a completely different beast. And, obviously, being a smaller manufacturer and one that people are concerned about, all of these protocols that we support, I call them the 4-letter words of networking. So those are like RSTP, DHCP, IGMP, EAPS.
Which, we won't go into the detail about that, but
Yeah.
I've seen the videos. They're well done. I highly recommend people check them out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's why we did it. That's why we make a VIA switch, and why people are willing to pay more for them.
From a layman's standpoint, if I'm somebody who's unfamiliar with theater, if I'm, I've done a lot of architectural lighting and maybe even a lot of architectural lighting controls, knowing that the theatrical framework and infrastructure really needs specialty equipment. You can't just do it with, your standard architectural fare systems. That's why they're more expensive. That's why they're more complex, is because of these specialty needs, such as, this very small example you had with DDoS protection. I mean, it's only because of the fact that DMX is constantly streaming information that it goes, wait a second, that's not normal. And it's like, well, yeah, no, because theater's not normal.
Yeah. And to be fair, our switches, and this is a bold statement, our switches don't do, with one exception, don't do anything that a Cisco switch doesn't do. The deal is, it will be consistent from show to show, and you don't need to go to school to configure them. Like, literally, Cisco black belt kung fu people are crazy scientists. I mean, it is not easy. It is not easy to configure these switches. They all support the same 4-letter words that we support. Mm-hmm. We do have one patented feature that nobody at Cisco would even understand, but we can receive broadcast lighting protocols, trap them right at the port, and convert them to multicast protocols. Now, that's something that's very, very specific. But our ring protection and our spanning tree and our DHCP and our IGMP and all of that stuff can be done if you know how to configure them
But it sounds like,
Um,
from an earlier comment you made, that convincing the architectural world why VIA isn't an easy thing to do. It's not an easy conversation to have with owners, contractors, distributors, etc., saying, okay, this is why it's X amount more than your standard fare, and you shouldn't sub it. Because again, coming from the theatrical world, you didn't question why something was selected. If a lighting designer wants this specific brand of fixture with this specific array of LEDs, you're not going to question it. They know why they selected that. Whereas in architectural world, it's like, well, but I can do that for cheaper. And it's almost like a move forward as a result of price, as opposed to, okay, well, but why did that person pick that specific thing?
well, if they make that choice, I hope they have their Cisco certified technician, as a member of their electrical contracting team, and he's willing to revisit it when somebody decides to do a firmware update, or when the switches go out to the cloud and get their firmware update themselves. Like nowadays, you can't. I don't care what company you work for; they will not let you use Windows XP. There's just too many holes and all the rest of it. So any government institution, they're going to insist that their Cisco switches have the latest, greatest firmware on them. And with that comes changes. We just did some tech support for a very large cruise line, and they were saying, your gateways have stopped working. And we're like, oh, well, what switches are they hooked up to? Well, IT on the ship has, I think it's Cisco Edge something, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, why are we just hearing about this now? The ship's about to sail, like it's a brand new ship. They said, well, everything was working for months of rehearsals, but somebody changed one of the core switches at the heart of the network. And I'm like, okay, well, then how is this my problem? How can I help you? Like, I'm not the Cisco expert. Like, it's clear. You told me, line in the sand, they broke it. You tell them how to fix it. And this went on for a very long time.
Wow.
And we tried to support them as best we could. I mean, one of the greatest reasons we sell these things is because our 800 number is on the back. And when you call us up and say, okay, I have a grandma too, and I'm trying to talk to the blah, 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 we actually understand what you mean by that,
Right.
Brian at the other end of our phone has actually done that. He worked at Disney for years. Like, we understand the environment in which our gear is being worked in. Hello, kitty.
Sorry, my cat just jumped up on my lap.
They have a habit of doing that.
So yeah, I mean, and I think that again is another distinct thing to the theatrical manufacturer lines, is that they're trying to be responsive to the needs at the moment. Whereas with architectural lines, it's, the show's not going to crash and burn tonight if they don't have an answer. So, there's a little bit more of a delay in response sometimes. I'm not saying that one customer service is better than the other. I'm just saying one is quicker than the other.
No,
so
but it's also very common. It's very common in an architectural world that we get the call that, oh, the light's out. Oh, this isn't working. Okay, well, how long has it been that way? Well, like 2 weeks.
Right.
Whereas in the theater world, it's, I have doors in 30 minutes. How do I fix this? Right? Like, it's a very different conversation.
Absolutely.
Our tech support team at Acuity is big, and they have an awful lot of tools at their disposal, but they also have hours. And and when we moved the factory, we moved our phone number, and now we're part of one of the automated trees, so we can get to the right product to the right tech support person. And we had to tell the people configuring the phone, we're like, at 5:01, don't immediately throw it to voicemail. Like, our busiest tech support time in the theater is between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. Like,
right.
And don't even turn it off at 8:01. Like, just ring the phone, and one of us will pick it up. And if we don't pick it up, we want to know that a voicemail was just left. And then you need to send that voicemail as a WAV file to all of our devices, all of our phones, so that, somebody picks up the phone, even at 11 o'clock at night on a long weekend, just it's a different mindset, isn't it, Ron?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
It's a very different
yeah, and
mindset.
so again, I think it's really interesting that you're, granted you've been a part of Acuity for so long, but now you're really embedded in the environment, the ecosystem that they have there, and so it's just really interesting to hear about how this synthesis has happened, and because I think again, a lot of people look at theater and go, oh, it's just like architecture, and it's not. There's so much that from beginning to end is different, that I'm glad to hear that there's at least receptiveness on the Acuity side to this difference, because you guys, Pathway has been in the game for a long time, and I I
Well,
love the product. So
Acuity was quite clever before they acquired Pathway, because they saw the dynamic thing coming, the LED thing. LEDification probably happened 5, 6 years earlier in entertainment than it did in architecture. When I first joined Acuity, I was involved in product meetings for the entire lighting division and controls and everything. And they're saying, "Oh, you're about to new troffer, a new product for something." The first checkbox on the business approval process was, "Is it LED?" And I always got the feeling that if it wasn't, this is again 12, 13 years ago, if it wasn't LED, it probably wouldn't get approved, right? But
mhm,
that's how new LED was. And uh, the big thing about LED, unlike um, um, tungsten, is there's no inertia, right? So there's all kinds of things you can do, like snap them on, snap them off. You can have two of them to tune to different color temperatures, and this is before you even get to RGB. So the whole control idiom changed, and I still giggle that so many of the LED drivers out there have a purple and a pink wire, or used to be a
mhm,
purple and a gray wire. I'm like, this is just ridiculous. We're taking the most advanced pulse width modulated drivers that are constant current and very intelligent, and and then we're using a 0-10 control signal to drive them. I'm like, this is just so backwards, and it's taken the world a long time, to get digital communication to these digital lights. I mean, LED lights are essentially digital. Um,
mhm,
so Enlight obviously has
Hmm.
like dominating the market. It is a digital communication. It's like right from controller through the backbone to the light is digital. Um, it can't respond at the speed that DMX does, but it certainly lends itself to A share and Title 24 and stuff like that, probably better than DMX does, just because of the way it communicates on the wire. Um, but yeah, this driving digital lights with analog signals. I can't wait for the end of that. We got to stop that as soon as possible.
You know what? There's so
it's
many electricians who still can't wrap their heads around 0 to 10, though. So I don't want to look forward too fast, because it's amazing how many of these guys still have a hard time with just 0 to 10.
It comes down to this:
Yep.
more little
well, so
screwdriver guys.
I mean, I don't think it's just the contractors, though. I mean, there are definitely contractors out there who know DMX very well and can handle
Oh,
it
yeah.
very easily. But at the same time, I think it boils down to all the way through specifiers, owners, everybody. In North America, we've just embraced 0 to 10 so wholeheartedly that it's really hard to separate 0 to
Mm,
10 from the concept of dimming, to the point where we have tunable white controlled by 0 to
Yeah.
10, which is, it's almost perfectly lending itself to DMX control. And yet we're still using analog control systems for those. So, I don't think that, you know, there's any one person we can point to and say, okay, you're what's holding us back. But at the same time, I think, the fact that it continues to have widespread success lends itself to maybe there is something still about 0 to 10 that keeps it around. I've heard arguments on either side, but you know, when you're comparing protocols just in a vacuum, yeah, I mean, I agree. DMX is far superior to 0 to 10.
Yeah. Well, and Pathway Connectivity, was founded by a gentleman named Dave Higgins, who's now a grandfather and retired. Um, he didn't mind being the middleware guy because that was his job. He was the black box guy that converted digital to analog. Like he even took AMX, which was a multiplexed analog signal, and converted it to DMX. But we still sell our D to A converter that takes 16 slots of DMX and makes it 16 analogs. And our snap panel does the same thing. So I can't poo-poo it too much. We make money off the fact that there's laggards in the industry that are not willing to adopt to it. But when you start mixing white light and dynamic RGB lighting, you're not going to go to a control system that doesn't natively speak DMX. It's so much easier to get DMX to bend back than it is to get an antiquated control system.
Speaking of languages, though, there's another thing that you talk about, which I really find fascinating, which is the natural language programming, or right. Is that the right term?
Yeah. No, and here we'll just shift gears from being on the wire to control. But that was. I'm going to tell a little bit more of my own story. So I worked right out of school. I worked in, like I said, I worked for a bit for Strand installing stuff, and then I went to a dealer in Canada that was selling and installing Strand systems, and CAD at the time was like really new, like it was even new in construction. People were building buildings using vellum and what do they call those mechanical pencils, or the waxy black ones? I can't remember what the term was, but anyways, people were doing stuff.
Grease pencil.
Thank you, grease pencil. People were drawing like that, and I can't draw a straight line. I can paint with light to take a turn from Richard Pilbrow, but I can't draw a picture. So I started drawing in CAD, and over from about, I guess I started that in 89, 90. It was like AutoCAD version 3. And I started writing more and more code. And what came out of that was something that's quite known quite well in the entertainment industry, is previsualization software called WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. So WYSIWYG was a product I started coding before I even joined the CBC. I did a whole bunch of work at the CBC where I got the attention of our press. And then I went on and I incorporated cast lighting, and we sold WYSIWYG for 10 years. I worked there until 2000. And part of my job description there was to design the libraries. So when U2 or Sting or Metallica were going out on tour with these brand new lights from high-end Claypaky, Comar, Very Light. I always said that Comar, Claypaky, Very Light, high-end systems, the firmware engineers that wrote all the motor code that made the lights move and change color, they didn't even know each other, and they never talked to each other. So the way they decided to slice and dice up the DMX frames to make a light flash red over here, might be completely different numbers to make a different manufacturer light flash over there. So what we had to do with WYSIWYG was unique at the time, was basically use reverse kinematics and a description language that could describe any light. We called it like the Uber light that could do anything. It could change colors. It could work in red, green, blue. It could work in CMY. It could work whatever. So myself and my partners at CAST, we came up with this model that could describe anything, and then we could apply it so that we could visualize a very light versus a high-end systems light. Anyways, when I left Cast, I was still frustrated that all of the controllers at the time, the Compulite animators, the Flying Pig Systems Whole Hog, the ETC Obsession, the Artisan console from Very Light, they all basically were glorified programmable logic devices, PLDs. They would basically say Q1 is this array of numbers, and Q2 is this array of numbers, and I want to get from this array to that array over 5 seconds, and it did a linear fade. And they were hopelessly unaware of what those numbers would become by the time they made photons that hit something on the stage and bounced off into somebody's eyeballs. So I wanted to fix that in the controller world. So I wrote a white paper many, many years ago now, called the Abstract Control Model at the time. And it was sort of doing the converse of what we did with WYSIWYG up at the controller end. So the idea is what you actually wrote to disk on the hard drive was pan this light so many degrees, hit this IEC color temperature or color wavelength, rotate this gobo clockwise, not counterclockwise, at so and so many RPMs and strobe in so many hertz. And then you could write the art onto your computer, and then at any point in time, you could swap out a Very Light for a high-end systems light or a clay packy light. And you would get the exact same or very, very close to the exact same thing on the stage. And we took that to the extreme when we did the abstract control model, which is currently, in our Cognito console. So you can actually have a mixed rig, and you could point the light in a certain direction, make it a certain color, even if it's RGB, additive lighting, or CMY subtractive lighting, or it uses a 4-color system versus a 3-color system. And you could even put in like a blocky breakup gobo that's rotating clockwise and a shutter that cuts off one half of it. And you could copy that with certainty to a completely different light. And the zeros and ones that go down the wire are going to be radically different because, again, the guy who built the firmware for the one light didn't even talk or know the name of the guy who built the firmware for the other light. They didn't agree upon anything. But the meeting point was this abstract control model. And that really turned the world on its head, to actually pan and tilt a light in degrees versus percentage. To rotate a pattern in front of the light in degrees or RPM, not a percentage. So we left percentage to things that made sense, like intensity. And otherwise, we removed it from almost everything. We gave real world units to everything. We also used percentage for iris, because it would say, okay, but you couldn't go down to 0% because the iris would never close. You would always have a dot in the middle. So it'd go from 100% down to maybe 86% or whatever the light was capable of doing. So that's a very short version of the abstract control model in natural language.
But I mean, it's a fascinating thing because I think, so many people outside of lighting controls think in that term, in what the abstract model is doing, whereas a lot of people in the lighting controls world think in the coding format.
I think that was a massive mistake, that a lighting designer who was trying to be an artist would have to think, and this is an extreme, in the zeros and ones that some guy who wrote the firmware that he never met decided upon. So when you were in the theater, and this is before I built my own control systems, when I was using other people's control systems, you would say, all right, back in the day when I was doing an awful lot of programming, the best combination was the Very Light VL5 and the high-end system Cyberlight and the Color Kinetics Color Blast. So as you started from a black stage and you started to paint a picture, you had, okay, let's bring up some incandescent lights. That's a group. Okay, then take the Very Lights, which were, CMY or whatever, and do them. And then take the Cyberlights and do their thing. And then take the the color kinetic lights and do their thing. Oh, let's go back to the cyber lights and adjust, and let's go. And I'm like, why are you telling the painter he has to use individual brushes when he just wants to paint something? Just they're all tools to get photons on the stage. It's ridiculous to make them think at the level of engineers when they're artists.
But I think that touches on a subject that we hit on in a previous conversation where, it's basically, at what level does the lighting designer need, is the lighting designer expected to continue forward versus just stop and have somebody else take the baton and carry it forward? Because I think, ultimately, you're right. We're talking about artists with lighting designers. We're not talking about people who are going to dig into the ones and zeros of a system. Whereas, there are people out there who do that. And so I think that's part of this whole new industry norm that we're experiencing when it comes to the DMX and other digital protocols coming into the architectural world, where they're much more complex. But maybe there's a way that we can make it at least easier for the lighting designer to manage with, and then have somebody else, such as an integrator, do the heavy lifting of the programming components. So
there was again, I've dated myself a number of times, but there was a watershed moment in the early 1990s where any theatrical show had a lighting board operator that ran the dim fixtures, and then there was the moving light programmer, not operator, that would interpret what the designer wanted and then figure out what tools and what zeros and ones were necessary to make that realization. And nowadays, the disciplines were very different. I'm not disparaging the lighting board operator that did white light, because I was one of them too. But it was a very different discipline. Now the control consoles, you would never do that. The control consoles can handle everything very well. But in the early days, like the Very Light console, which was used on a lot of Broadway shows in the early 90s, it didn't even have a display. It really was. You look out, like you typed and you saw stuff move out there. There wasn't. There was zero. There wasn't a CRT. There wasn't a display on the thing. So you needed somebody who was hyper aware of the protocol and the capabilities of the lights. And it was just an evolution. I mean, many of the consoles today take aspects of our abstract language controller or natural language control is what Acuity rebranded it. So a lot of consoles now, even the smaller consoles, you pan and tilt in degrees.
Well, so we're almost out of time here, but I just want to summarize. I mean, we've jumped around a lot, but I think we've touched on a lot of interesting subject matters here when it comes to what your involvement and engagement in this industry is. And I think your introduction to the architectural side is really welcome, because our industry really could benefit from your knowledge and experience of just basic DMX or networking, or making everything function for a theatrical purpose, because of architainment is growing in popularity, and so really thinking through a theatrical type of application, whether it's just a small studio or if it's a big multimedia extravaganza, it's not something you can take architectural perspectives and just hammer them in to place. You need to have this special hardware, this special programming language, that all of this focus to make it achievable. And so I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people look at a cafetorium on a plan and just draw a circle around it and say that's somebody else's problem, because of the fact that it really should be somebody else's responsibility. So when we're talking about a sub brand of a bigger group or a brand on its own, if it's theatrically focused, specialized, there's a reason. And there's a reason why there's a higher price tag. There's a reason why it may go through a dealer. There's a reason why you're going to have a theatrical consultant involved. And, we deal with this on a daily basis right now because everybody wants to upgrade their theaters, or they want to have this, extravaganza added to their project. But they go, well, wait a second, why is this so expensive? And it's like,
yeah. Well, I you wouldn't want a general contractor that builds hospitals necessarily building a runway or a sewage plant, right? Or just an apartment block, right? There's general contractors that are really good at building townhouses, and there's general contractors that are capable of building tunnels under, large bodies of water or nuclear power plants. There is specialty, and we just have to bring the right people to the table. And I'm keen. You know me. I like to educate, so I'm keen to take and try to explain to the best of the ability anything that anybody wants to learn. I don't care where they come from. But if you want the short path, find somebody who actually understands the technology that is needed for the building that you're building.
Well said. Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming in and enjoyed the conversation.
Ron, Webster, I love the podcast. Thanks for inviting me. I feel privileged.
Awesome.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed that conversation, because Ron and I really enjoyed that. There's a lot of great information in there. And if you want to learn anything more, you should check out the lightingcontrolspodcast.com, which is where this will be formally hosted. Just letting you know that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Also, we just want to thank our sponsor today, Acuity Brands and Pathway Connectivity Solutions. Ron's got some other helpful information about them. Ron?
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to thank Robert again for a fantastic conversation, and just want to remind everyone about all the solutions that Pathway has to offer and what they can help you with on your next project. Whether it's architectural or theatrical, Pathway's got you covered. They make everything from DMX splitters and mergers to DMX gateways, purpose-built switches, which you know a lot more about now than you did earlier, and they offer full control solutions to include relay panels, button and fader stations, and touchscreen interfaces. And don't forget about all their devices that can be cloud connected.
So check out acuitybrands.com, where you can find out Pathway Connectivity Solutions or other Acuity Brands information. Thank you so much for sponsoring this episode, and thank you, Robert, for a great conversation.